Greetings, everyone. I'm Sophis, and I've got Bootman with me again. This one should be a fairly shorter video. This is mostly a follow up to our last discussion because I think everyone's just as excited as we are for season 3, and there's been some pretty nice stuff about the vampire rulers. We've got two dev diaries. This one I kind of went over just a little bit in a short note in the last part. And today I think we can go a little more into it and discuss as well the things from the other dev diary. We could have waited, for a little more info, but I think we have enough. I mean, they've shown pretty much everything off, don't they? I mean, we don't have a lot missing aside from like two tomes. I think everything else was more or less sorted out because they've shown ancient wonders. They've shown, I think, most everything really.
Yeah,
Uh,
pretty much. I wouldn't say that there's too much left out. Big things that we still don't have. We kind of want more information on the cult of death dark subculture. The biggest of the gray areas right now is the new tier 4 tome. That one, I'm just not sure entirely what's going on with it because it says some things and then they've said some things, and what we do know about it, I'm not quite sure exactly what form it's going to take.
yeah, I mean, there's been quite a bit of speculation on our end as far as what that tome does because like you've said some other time, that the tier 4 tome was going to be about boosting high level units, but there's also all this stuff that it already does. So it's a little unclear of what form that might take. And
Exactly.
I guess we'll see more of that, I believe, Thursday, because they're going to do a second dev stream and that'll be interesting to look into. But
Yep.
yeah, that aside, we do have pretty much everything else on Thrones of Blood uh, laid right before us. Well, vampire rulers, I think, are pretty neat. I think a small detail that we haven't really gone over, it's more aesthetic, but we can see right here in this GIF, we can finally have different eye colors depending on, you can have a kind of a heterochromia thing that might help some designs. I hope that's not just for vampire rulers. We get that for other stuff because, any extra little tidbit of customization is good. Um, I believe yourself were saying, Bootman, that customization, it's nice, but it kind of isn't perfectly implemented. And to that,
Oh,
I've
it is not.
yeah, and to that I've said I think that's due to how Age of Wonders 3, I mean, yeah, Age of Wonders 3 and Age of Wonders 4, Planetfall set an expectation. And I think they released the base Age of Wonders 4 with the expectation of it being of similar success to Planetfall and Age of Wonders 3, and it just blew up. So I think it's a matter of, they didn't make the character creator as robust as they could have made it because they were expecting it to be a title of a certain size. I mean, that's pure speculation on my end, but I think it's a reasonable thing to consider because yeah, nowadays, three seasons in, we're looking a lot into leader customization, and there's a lot of mods all about expanding customization. So I think the player base does care pretty much for customization. I mean, it is the core of what defines Age of Wonders 4. You can make everything customizable. You can make your faction, your race, everything is tailor made. So if they're going to make changes, it would have to be a big update because, for instance, we do have now with the architect culture customization of two army colors instead of just a base army color. You can change accents and all that, and even that is not that complex. I mean, in theory, but I'm sure technically has its cost, and yeah, I don't know if they'll implement it, but it would be neat to implement it, as it keeps growing and hopefully as the game gets bigger. And I do think Age of Wonders 3 Age of Wonders 4 has space to get bigger, but that's also due to the current scenario that this kind of game, the industry in this part is facing. Bootman has some thoughts on Crusader Kings 3, and I have some on Warhammer 3, but that's a subject for another time.
Yeah, I think that the customization is actually really well implemented in Age of Wonders 4. You can get a shocking amount done with their relatively minimal system. Um, it really is quite workable in its current state. And honestly, I think that if you weren't someone like me, where I have 40 characters, my pantheon right now, and so I definitely think that I've pushed it more to the limit than what they would expect, and there's still plenty of things left for me to do. I would just like more options, especially for things like the giants, the dragons, and the eldritch sovereigns. I would really like more options over in that front. But yeah, I think that will probably get heterochromia for everybody. I don't know why they would limit it just to vampires unless there's some sort of lore or thematic reason that I'm missing.
Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I think it will get implemented for everyone, and we'll see a little more customization, just like when they dropped. Was it? When was it that they dropped the body shapes? It wasn't the last patch. It was.
That was the Giant Kings update.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Giant Kings. Yeah. So this, I guess, is a new extra little thing that we'll play around with, and hopefully this isn't the last thing we get for everyone. I mean, for sure would like a little more kit bashing, and as we discussed some other time, I think Wizard Kings could benefit from being able to get, if not all, at least some pieces from the culture that they're leading, so that they can be customized with similarly to a champion. Maybe don't get everything a champion can, but some pieces from the culture. That would be pretty neat. I know that the point of a Wizard King is looking alien and a bit detached from its culture and what they're leading, but ultimately it still is an instrument of their will and their influence. So I think it has its place. Again, yeah, confirmations that we'll be getting vampire heroes, we'll be getting rituals, and it goes into the whole point of, it has a pretty nice, I think, unique tree. We have new effects. I quite like this. I think it feels robust in a similar way to the other ruler types, and there's enough wiggle room here to kind of shape your vampire. I think this has no. It, I'm not sure. I think either Giant or Eldritch Sovereign have the most icons in their tree. This one is still quite a lot, but that might just be because it's everything put together. Usually you have like three separate branches for everyone.
Yeah, it's gonna be quite a bit. It only gonna beat giants, like you say. Let me see. Well, let's see. That's about equal to giants. It's somewhere in the same zone, maybe a bit less. One thing I really like though is outside of the skill tree, I like what they've done with the quote unquote affinities for the vampires because basically you get a active ability and a passive ability at each of the big ones. And I think that's a really cool way of doing it because they want you to have like the cool, flavorful vampiric stuff, but not sacrifice the typically more consistent and powerful passive gains.
Yeah, that's fair. I think, yeah, this will pretty much shape up the general fantasy of the vampires and how you want to play them. Because vampires certainly have all sorts of types and flavors. Well, I think, yeah, here we get a lot of stuff. This I feel is somewhat improved from what they did with Eldritch Sovereign, because not to say, not to go on again about how Eldritch Sovereigns feel a little bit pigeonholed, but Vampire is in a way kind of pigeonholed into being what it is. But this feels like it gives you enough depth to play around more with the niche you were given, so you have a lot more option. Well, not a lot, but it feels more fleshed out, at least. I think one thing I've said time and again, it's they keep getting better, and sadly stuff they do earlier suffers by comparison because they've been getting better at implementing these things and their ideas.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty accurate. But a lot of times they'll go back and they will improve things, as we've talked about. So that's why I'm a big fan of these guys, and I'm hopeful that they'll continue to do so as they go forward, and take whatever chances they can to improve the previous things. But Vampire's definitely seem the most exciting. There's a lot of cool stuff. I'd say, in general, I'm a big fan of the Eldritch Sovereigns tree and their affinities, and this seems like it's going to be, the same, if not better. It's less like big magical artillery and more this crazy toolkit of vampiric abilities, and I'm all here for it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I would say that Eldritch Sovereigns, they kinda affect your empire. I would say they affect it more than, say, a Wizard King or a Champion do. And then you have dragons, which do affect it mostly through the Horde, I would say. And then you have giants that affect it quite a bit thanks to the Forge. But I would say vampires are probably the ones that affect a culture the most. Far as me picking this will affect my build more significantly than other ruler types. At least that's the impression I'm getting, far as impact to how you will perform and prioritize things during gameplay.
Yeah, I think that that's probably accurate, though I do think that as opposed to certain other ones like giants, the giant affinities very much impact your entire army and strategy. I think these are going to be more focused than giants on the individual themselves. So there is that.
Yeah, and in a way, you can argue that, vampires and giants both spread their terrain and have, they sort of corrupt the original terrain, if we want to call what the giants do a corruption. And I think for the giant, yes, they can shape a lot of stuff. A storm giant can turn a map into a giant riverland, but it isn't necessary for your strategy as a giant. You can kind of ignore that if you really want. As a vampire, however, we have, as they are detailing here, we kind of have to rely on sunless terrain. So the impact is kind of a requirement due to our leader and, of course, the heroes we corrupt being kind of tied to this terrain type, to the darkness, to everything. So I do think that's, kind of a give and take of it. They have to affect more because they are both stronger and weaker if you play with this mechanic. You have to play with corruption. And I'm kind of curious if turning heroes into vampires is an individual choice or a group choice. Like, can you have a hero that is unturned just so you can have a war front outside of your sunless realms?
Well, I would say the Sunless Realms stuff, there definitely is things to say about that in terms of how it affects your empire. Um, I'm not entirely confident in speaking firmly about it because it's not entirely clear the subtleties of the interaction. Like, for instance, I know that it works best when you have either a vampire ruler or your race is heartless. But even setting that aside, what happens if you have another race within your empire that isn't the initial core race? Will that no longer have the correct protections. I imagine if it's a vampire ruler, it will, because they're not a bunch of hacks over there at Triumph. They tend to are pretty they tend to be pretty good about that sort of thing. But it's just interesting to consider that. As far as ascending the heroes, though, yeah, so it looks like the heroes are recruited as turned vampires. It is not an individual process. No, it seems to be as you recruit them, they just are already turned vampires.
Well, I suppose that's fair because you're making a choice by making a vampire ruler, so you're stuck with that choice and you have to have a vampire coven.
Yes, I'm very okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise we would have kind of a because I'm thinking more, in terms of Dracula, that Dracula had someone like, Renfield, who was kind of a harbinger to his arrival. And that would be neat because if we have to rely on sunless terrain, it would be neat to have someone who isn't affected by it. Although I suppose, well, I'm just thinking of the possibilities because, yeah, if the heroes are going to be vampires, they will be subjected to needing to be in the corruption as well as your leader. But
Yep.
I guess then heroless stacks become valuable for these sort of rulers because how are you going to make a foray into a terrain where you don't have that? And I mean, I'm sure that the debuffs that you suffer from being outside of sunless terrain aren't like, game ending. I'm sure it's going to
They aren't.
sting. Yeah, it's going to sting, but it's not going to, you know, stop you from going outside to fight.
Yeah.
But yeah, that definitely makes you have to change your priorities quite a bit, which again is why I think vampire is the leader type that affects your build and faction the most because you have all these extra considerations. The other neat thing we were discussing was the whole thing about how the terrain spreads flora in combat, right? The rose thorns thing.
Yeah, the rose thorns are very interesting.
The fun thing, we discussed the possibility of famous blending super well with this, which it does, but another thing that occurred to me is the trait that lets you devour plants to kind of
Yep.
restore yourself. So having, restoring flora and mists and a way to consume that flora to restore yourself would make for a surprisingly defensive setup, I think because then someone goes into your realm and they have to contend with accuracy penalties, they have to contend with this spreading thorns, and they have to contend with this being kind of a passive healing for you. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think this makes for a very strong um, combination, and I'll definitely on the first build they release once this DLC drops will definitely be something with famous in it because I think it's just too good to pass up the possibility of having such a defensive terrain. Bootman, you were talking about how because you were interested in what sunless terrain kind of combos with. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Uh, yeah. So the most interesting thing about Sunless to me is how it combines with different environments. So they've said specifically that it does combine with the core environment traits. So that's Arctic, desert, ashlands, and swamp from the core traits. So that's interesting enough on its own. I'm really curious if it's going to combine with chasm as well, because if you could have a chasm sunless space, that is going to be a very severe stability penalty to other people. Like if you spread that into other people's territory, that's going to really give them a bad time. Aside from that, it you can make something really difficult to maneuver through. I think that probably sunless snow is going to be a pretty nasty terrain to try and get through. Yeah, those are my main thoughts on Sunless interacting with terrain types.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I like the idea of what you said of Sunless Chasm, because if it does combine, it's once again a show of there being builds and synergies that go beyond a single faction. Just like how high is the one that can make longbows have the maximum range possible in the game. And if you can combine a vampire ruler with a fire giant and create something that just creates mass instability in enemy territory, now that would be quite interesting.
Very much so, especially since that's probably my biggest gripe with umbral terrain is how it just completely overwrites any other terrain that's going on.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, if it does combine, it's going to be interesting. And it probably should combine because you have to consider what happens if a giant invades a vampire's terrain and drops one of the rune spells. It is a fresh spell, so you should expect as a player, if you're spending resources to do this, that what would spread, would actually spread and work and blend with the terrain. So
Yeah.
I mean, just looking right here at this picture, where you do have rivers. If I'm a storm giant and I drop a rune near this castle, I expect the river to start pulling up and around into these tiles because that's what the storm giant does. It spreads rivers. So I think it's probably safe to say that it does blend. And if it doesn't blend, it's meant to, because otherwise it would be very strange. But yeah, as you said, I mean, I think that would be extra valuable actually, being able to make just this horrible zone of don't annex this. If you annex this, you're going to have a very bad time.
Well, yeah, I had a build recently where I was spreading umbral to my neighbor, and it basically just completely messed up everything they were doing. Like, I'll be honest, the CPU currently doesn't have an effective response to spreading umbral in their territory. It really goozles the CPU currently.
That's pretty amusing to imagine. I think another, well, I mean, a cool thing you could do as well is keep inciting rebellion and creating, more bandit infestations. But that's a specific build. But yeah, I think it's pretty nice that we're going into more than just Umbral as a corruption, and we're seeing different types of altering terrain because terraforming used to be a huge thing in earlier Age of Wonders, especially 3. You could, sprout mountains around your capital and just have this horribly defensible thing where it was a nightmare for anyone to get through to get to you. And now we're
Yeah.
seeing, yeah, now we're seeing a comeback of just how flexible, the terrain was, where you could kind of shift around everything. Of course, they've been very smart. They kept mountains very relevant, and so far we only have means to remove them, not add them. Because if we could add them or add oceans, then I think things would get really out of hand, at least as far as balancing goes in the current situation. Because mountains are kind of a pain to get through if you don't have flying. I think even more so than in 3.
Yeah, I'd say so. I think they're pretty cool and effective the way they are. And I think that the issue with adding something that, say, increases the number of ocean provinces, the issue is you would need to have an easily accessible counterattack to like everyone that can get that. Because otherwise, if you don't have one of the very straightforward methods of fighting it, you'll just get drowned out and there's nothing to deal with it.
Yeah, I think hopefully we won't get to that point, and if we do get to that point, it's within the mindset of it being balanced, because otherwise it will get out of hand pretty quick. I think even Planetfall has had some pretty aggressive terraforming that you could do that got out of hand really quick, both for gameplay and for melting your computer. So yeah, the last thing I just want to quickly go over, because again, this is meant to be a pretty short, just continuation to the original. Is yeah, the new material. Now, yeah, they say that there's, it's obviously tied to new stuff, blood magic, torment effect, the parasite effect, everything new we're getting there. The interesting thing to me is that it was added to an existing collection, and the requirement is just three. Now, that I think establishes kind of a precedent, because maybe with other expansions, for instance, Rise from Ruin, since everything is ruined, let's say that adds a new province type like Sunless Realms. Is it going to have a unique thing? Because by now we have Voidstone, and now we'll have Blood Glass. It's going to be interesting, I think. It's going to have a little more flexibility, because sometimes it isn't as simple to complete a collection. But yeah, just
Yeah.
a small note. I think it's a neat thing. Uh, what remains, of the dev diary, I think, doesn't matter as much. An ancient wonder is an ancient wonder. Not much to say there. The landmark is kind of neat. The fact that it spreads, corruption, even if you're not a vampire ruler, is kind of cool, because then
Yeah.
you have a kind of Faustian deal going on, where you have to weigh whether the benefits of it for your particular build, are worth basically ruining your public order and all that.
No, I just think that in terms of the the cool things they're adding with these sunless terrains, I'm interested in the more interactive tactical aspects of the map. The Banshee Pod and the Rose Bushes are both really cool and really unique. So I'd be interested in them potentially doing more of that going forward.
I think maybe again, like we said, they keep improving things, and the earlier stuff kind of looks lesser compared to the new stuff. So it would be neat if they went back to Umbral and did a pass on, new extra goodies for fighting in an Umbral territory, not just the whole, oh, you don't heal as well, which is more of a campaign concern rather than a battle concern.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's it, everyone. We really just wanted to have a small compliment to the original talk about season three. Now that we got more info, basically we will just be missing, the other two tomes, and at that point, I don't think we really need to talk about it. I mean, we'll see it when it comes out. So this follow up also is going to more or less cover, rather than do another whole talk closer to release. I think they've shown pretty much everything, and now we just have to endure a whole other month of waiting. At least
Yeah.
now, yeah, now it's less time than before, and soon enough we'll all be sinking our teeth into the whole vampire expansion. So yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks Bootman as always, and I'll see you all in the next one.